Sometimes it's not the name you fear, it's the darkness hiding behind it. 6 David Johnsons. 6 devastating crimes. 1 chilling pattern no one saw coming. Across the scattered map of America, in states divided by rivers, mountains, and thousands of miles, a strange and unsettling phenomenon began to take shape. Not a serial killer, not a cult, but 6 men, all sharing the same name, David Johnson, who independently carved their own trails of destruction into the annals of true crime history. When you hear about a criminal, you usually expect a specific story, a single monster, one face to blame. But what happens when different lives, different motives, and different crimes collide under a shared identity, a name that becomes almost cursed? Welcome to a story that feels like fiction, but is chillingly real. Today, we'll dive into the shocking true accounts of 6 men who turned from ordinary lives into devastating headlines. Their crimes stretch across time, from the 1970s inside one of America's most notorious prisons to a chilling, unsolved murder on the urban streets of Philadelphia in 2021. Their motives vary: greed, rage, survival, desperation. But the consequences are hauntingly similar: lives shattered, communities traumatized, and justice hanging by a thread. Each case you'll hear today could stand alone as a heartbreaking tale. Each one raises questions that have no easy answers. But together, they create a pattern so disturbing you'll wonder, is it possible that a name alone can carry the weight of destiny? Before we dive into these 6 chilling stories, let's ask a few unsettling questions. How does an everyday man with no criminal past suddenly become a cold-blooded killer? What forces push ordinary people into committing the unthinkable? And most haunting of all, is evil born or made? Prepare yourself. This isn't just a collection of crimes. This is a journey into the heart of human darkness. 6 lives, 6 crimes, 1 name, David Johnson. But before we dive deeper, a warning. Some of the details you're about to hear may stay with you longer than you expect. Some tragedies refuse to fade away, and some names refuse to be forgotten. And now, we begin. Case 1. David Dwayne Johnson, Arkansas, 1989. A desperate man. An isolated warehouse. A night watchman whose only crime was kindness, and whose final moments were soaked in brutality. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized something chilling. The killer didn't just want to rob, he wanted to erase. It was supposed to be just another night shift, until a stranger knocked on the door, and kindness opened it. September 2nd, 1989. A humid Saturday night blanketed Little Rock, Arkansas. Most of the city was winding down, porch lights flickering on, TVs humming behind closed blinds, a slow, sticky breeze carrying the smell of late summer. Inside the Little Rock Crate and Basket Company, a modest warehouse tucked away on the industrial side of town, 67-year-old Leon Brown prepared for another uneventful night of security work. Leon had been doing this for years, watching over the building, making rounds every few hours, sipping bad coffee from a chipped thermos. A simple man, trusted by his employers and beloved by his small family. That night, shortly after 9 p.m., a man approached the building, waving frantically at the glass door. Tall, gaunt, eyes darting in nervous urgency, David Dwayne Johnson claimed his car had broken down in a nearby ditch and begged to use the company phone. Leon hesitated for a moment. Something about the man's restless energy raised the hair on his neck. But kindness won out over caution. Leon unbolted the door and let him inside. Within an hour, Leon Brown would be dead, his skull crushed, blood pooling under flickering fluorescent lights, and David Dwayne Johnson would vanish into the darkness, carrying stolen goods and a secret. It was the next shift change that discovered the horror. A delivery driver named Hal Simmons arrived just after dawn, expecting to see Leon at the front desk with a sleepy wave and a bad joke. Instead, he found silence and blood. Police arrived quickly, their boots squeaking on the blood-streaked concrete floor. Leon's body was found slumped against a crate, his head battered by a blood-stained 2x4 board, likely ripped from one of the shipping pallets stacked in the corner. The warehouse had been ransacked, toolboxes emptied, crates pried open, a few pieces of equipment missing. A robbery, it seemed. But why the overkill? Forensics found fingerprints smeared on the glass door, on a stolen crowbar, and chillingly, on the murder weapon itself. And when they ran them through the system, one name came back almost immediately: David Dwayne Johnson. Johnson wasn't an unknown entity. He had a rap sheet, mostly petty theft, some drug charges, a few suspicious fights, but nothing suggesting he was capable of this level of brutality. What changed? Investigators would soon realize they weren't just chasing a desperate thief. They were hunting a man who had crossed an invisible line, a line few return from. The first break came with the fingerprints. The second came when Johnson made his first mistake. Just 2 days after the murder, a pawn shop in a rough part of town flagged suspicious items: industrial-grade tools, electrical components, and a battered, distinctive toolbox still bearing the Crate and Basket Company logo. When police raided the shop, they found even more than stolen property. The pawn slip listed David Johnson's real name, along with a fake address. A manhunt began. Tips flooded in. An ex-girlfriend said she had seen Johnson packing bags and talking about getting out west. A motel manager remembered renting a room to a jittery man who paid in cash and refused cleaning services. Finally, they found him, crouched behind a dumpster behind an abandoned gas station, clothes soaked from rain, eyes wild with panic. At first, Johnson tried to deny everything, said he had no idea who Leon Brown was, that he hadn't been near that warehouse. But the evidence, fingerprints, pawn receipts, surveillance footage showing him walking near the Crate Company that night, stacked up fast. Within hours, under relentless questioning, the facade cracked. Johnson confessed, though his version of events painted himself as a victim of circumstance. He claimed Leon had attacked him first, that he acted in self-defense. But the blood patterns, the sheer violence of the beating, told a different story. Leon never stood a chance. Desperation, addiction, rage. In the months leading up to the murder, Johnson's life had spiraled into chaos. Unemployed, homeless, hooked on crack cocaine and methamphetamine, living day to day, dollar to dollar, robbing scrap yards and pawn shops to feed his habit. But even desperation doesn't fully explain the brutality unleashed that night. Investigators believe Johnson had gone to the Crate Company, intending to steal. Leon's kindness, letting him inside, had complicated the plan. And somewhere between the entry and the exit, Johnson decided that Leon was an obstacle. The 2x4 was picked up during the struggle and swung with a rage that went beyond simple survival. It wasn't just about money. It was about eliminating a witness, a robbery gone wrong, or a murder fully intended from the moment Johnson knocked on that door. Maybe both. In March 1990, David Dwayne Johnson stood trial for the capital murder of Leon Brown. The courtroom was tense, filled with Brown's grieving family members and citizens still stunned that such violence had erupted in their city. Johnson's defense team argued diminished capacity, citing his drug addiction and mental impairment at the time of the crime. The prosecution painted a far grimmer portrait, a predator who manipulated an old man's compassion into a death sentence. The jury deliberated just 5 hours before returning a verdict: guilty of capital murder. Johnson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Years of appeals followed, automatic under death penalty law, but none swayed the courts. On December 19, 2000, after more than a decade on death row, David Dwayne Johnson was executed at the Cumin unit in Arkansas. He offered no final words, no apology, no explanation, just silence. And in the end, perhaps that was all that remained. A name, a crime, and a silence that stretched longer than the night Leon Brown lost his life. But as chilling as the story of David Dwayne Johnson is, another David Johnson hundreds of miles away would unleash a horror even darker, targeting someone far more vulnerable, a child. Coming up next, Case 2, David Lynn Johnson, Texas, 2012. Some monsters don't wear masks. They hide behind a smile until it's too late. San Saba, Texas, a town small enough that strangers stand out, a place where people still wave when they drive by, where bad news travels faster than the wind through the trees. It was here, in this close-knit hill country community, that David Lynn Johnson shattered the trust that held the town together, in a way so vile, so unforgivable, that even hardened detectives later admitted it haunted them. The year was 2012. Johnson, 39 years old at the time, was known as a handyman, a drifter who took odd jobs fixing roofs, cleaning gutters, painting fences. He smiled easy, charmed faster. No one suspected the darkness lurking beneath. At first, it was just whispers. A child, a 12-year-old girl, suddenly withdrawn, jumpy, flinching when her mother reached for her hand. Then came the confession, the broken words, the horrific truth. David Lynn Johnson had raped her, repeatedly. And that was just the beginning of the nightmare. The revelation exploded like dynamite through the community. San Saba had seen its share of hardship, droughts, floods, fires, but nothing like this. Not here, not among people you trusted. The victim, whose name was withheld for privacy, bravely came forward after weeks of silent suffering. At first, she only told a teacher, trembling, half-whispered admissions. But the teacher listened carefully and called authorities. When police first brought Johnson in for questioning, he laughed, joked, tried to explain it away as misunderstanding. It wasn't until officers confronted him with the child's detailed account, and later the medical evidence, that Johnson's easy charm evaporated. In a desperate move, Johnson tried to manipulate the system one more time. He approached the victim's family through intermediaries, offering money, gifts, anything if they would make the charges go away. Tampering with a witness, obstruction of justice, his crimes compounded layer by filthy layer. The investigation was meticulous. Detectives interviewed every family member, every neighbor. They combed through Johnson's background, digging deep into a history of red flags missed by other towns he had drifted through. Forensic evidence from the child's examination was damning. Text messages recovered from a discarded phone hinted at grooming behavior. Attempts to gain the trust of the victim over weeks before the assault. In a chilling twist, investigators also found Johnson had once been questioned, but never charged, in another town for inappropriate behavior with a minor. No charges were filed back then, not enough evidence. No one wanted to ruin a man's life over whispers. This time, the whispers turned to screams for justice. The tampering charges added a sinister layer to the case. Johnson wasn't just a predator. He was a manipulator willing to silence his victims by any means necessary. The courtroom would hear every sordid detail. What drives a man to destroy innocence? Control, power, the sick satisfaction of dominance over the vulnerable. Psychologists later described Johnson as a textbook case of opportunistic predation, someone who sought out those least able to defend themselves and then used charm, fear, and shame to keep them silent. But when that silence was finally broken, Johnson's true character surfaced. Desperation, bribery, threats. He didn't deny the crime out of remorse. He fought exposure because he feared losing the little power he had left, and he would lose everything. In 2016, after 4 years of legal delays, plea deals rejected, and repeated attempts at witness intimidation, David Lynn Johnson finally faced his reckoning. The courtroom was filled with tense faces, townspeople who had once trusted him, now here to watch him fall. The trial was merciless. The prosecution laid bare every horror, the child's brave testimony, the forensic proof, the bribe attempts recorded in secret by investigators. The jury returned a verdict in less than 3 hours. Guilty. Johnson was sentenced to 40 years for aggravated sexual assault of a child, 25 years for tampering with a witness. The judge ruled the sentences would run concurrently, a technical mercy, but with parole eligibility only after serving 20 years. David Lynn Johnson left the courtroom that day in chains. The same chains he had metaphorically placed on an innocent child. But as David Lynn Johnson rotted behind bars, another man, another David Johnson, was orchestrating a much deadlier crime across state lines, a robbery that would end not just in theft, but in blood. Coming up next, Case 3, James David Johnson, Tennessee, 2005. Some crimes are planned in whispers, others are executed in gunfire. It was a humid night in Chattanooga, Tennessee. June 14, 2005. The air was thick, the kind that clings to your skin, makes breathing feel like work. For Timothy Robinson, it was supposed to be just another evening. Finish his delivery run, clock out, get home to his wife and kids. But Timothy never made it back. Waiting in the shadows was James David Johnson, a man whose path had twisted over years of petty crimes, dead-end jobs, and a growing taste for easy money. Johnson wasn't alone that night. He had an accomplice, someone just as desperate, just as willing to trade human life for cash. The plan was simple. Find Robinson, take the money. If he resisted, silence him. No witnesses, no problems. They thought it would be clean, quick. But murder is never clean. And this night would stain the city forever. The next morning, the headlines screamed, "Truck driver gunned down in robbery gone wrong." Timothy Robinson was found slumped over in his truck, parked on a desolate stretch of road outside Chattanooga. Blood soaked the cab. The delivery logs and cash receipts, gone. But what truly shook investigators was the brutality of it all. Timothy hadn't just been shot once. There were 3 gunshots, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head, execution style. This wasn't panic, this was intent. When officers combed the scene, a witness emerged. A night shift gas station clerk down the road who remembered seeing a suspicious vehicle, a beat-up Chevy Impala, trailing Timothy's truck hours earlier. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses offered blurry images. A man fitting James David Johnson's description lingering by Timothy's truck earlier that night. The pieces were falling into place, and they spelled murder. The investigation into Timothy's death was relentless. Detectives worked around the clock, chasing every lead, reviewing hours of footage, analyzing financial records. The break came when a tipster, an old associate of Johnson's, came forward. Spurred by a $10,000 reward and maybe a guilty conscience, he revealed chilling details. Johnson had bragged about the robbery, had even shown off a wad of cash days later, flashing it at a downtown bar. When Johnson was arrested 2 weeks later, he was calm, cocky even. He insisted he wasn't even in Chattanooga that night, but his cell phone betrayed him. Tower pings placed him near the crime scene during the critical window. Further forensic analysis found traces of gunshot residue on his clothes and tiny blood spatters on the passenger seat of his Impala. The accomplice folded first. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he struck a deal. Testify against Johnson in exchange for a reduced sentence. The court now had a complete picture of the crime, the planning, the execution, the callous indifference. It was as if Timothy Robinson's life had been no more meaningful to James David Johnson than the cash he carried. Money, simple, cold, ugly. James David Johnson was drowning in debt, evictions, past due notices, child support payments he couldn't meet, warrants he couldn't outrun. He needed a quick score, and he was willing to kill for it. But underneath the desperation was something darker, an escalating pattern of violence. Friends and family later testified that Johnson had always had a temper, a short fuse, a habit of viewing other people's property and lives as obstacles to what he wanted. The murder wasn't a freak accident. It was a natural endpoint to a life spiraling into chaos. The courtroom was packed for Johnson's trial. Timothy Robinson's family filled the front rows, his wife clutching their youngest child, trying to stay strong as the prosecution laid out every grisly detail. The evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, cell tower records, ballistics matching the bullet to a gun Johnson was seen discarding after the murder. Eyewitness testimony from Johnson's accomplice. Johnson's defense scrambled for a strategy. They tried to argue mistaken identity. They floated the theory that the accomplice was the real killer, and Johnson was just along for the ride. But the jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict. Guilty of premeditated first-degree murder, guilty of aggravated robbery, guilty of theft over $10,000. On December 15, 2005, James David Johnson was sentenced to life in prison for murder, 25 years for aggravated robbery, and 10 years for theft. All sentences to be served consecutively. There would be no second chance, no parole, no redemption. For the Robinson family, justice was served, but nothing could fill the void Timothy left behind. As James David Johnson began his life sentence, another David Johnson, this one hundreds of miles away, would meet a fate far darker. His name would end up not on a prison roster, but on a cold slab in a Philadelphia morgue. Coming up next, Case 4, David Johnson, Philadelphia, 2021. Sometimes death comes not with warning, but with a whisper in the city's heart. May 24th, 2021. Philadelphia's Bainbridge Street was unusually quiet for a Monday evening. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalks. A cool breeze carried the faint smell of summer rain. And then, gunfire. The 911 call came in at 9:32 p.m. Shots fired. Someone's been hit. There's a man slumped in a white Mercedes-Benz. By the time officers arrived, the luxury car was like a tomb. Inside, 38-year-old David Johnson sat motionless behind the wheel, his body riddled with bullets. Blood pooled on the leather seats. The ignition was still on. Music still playing faintly from the car's speakers. A cruel echo of life in a vehicle now filled with death. Near the car, another man lay on the ground, barely clinging to life. A cold-blooded execution in one of the city's most gentrified neighborhoods. But who wanted David Johnson dead? And why? At first glance, David Johnson's murder made no sense. This wasn't some street corner drug dealer. This wasn't a gang war victim. This was a quiet man from Coatesville, Pennsylvania, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. David had no lengthy criminal record, no known enemies, no reason, at least on the surface, to die so violently. As investigators peeled back the layers of David's life, inconsistencies began to emerge. Recent calls to unknown numbers, bank accounts that didn't quite add up, meetings at odd hours with people no one could identify. Had David been living a double life? Was he involved in something darker than anyone knew? The city buzzed with rumors. Was it a drug deal gone wrong? Was he set up by someone he trusted? One thing was certain. Someone wanted David Johnson silenced, permanently. Detectives treated the Mercedes like a sacred crime scene. Gloved hands collected bullet casings, pulled fingerprints off door handles, and dusted for latent prints. But the evidence was sparse. The bullets were from a common caliber, untraceable. The street cameras nearby, either broken or facing the wrong way. No shell casings on the street, suggesting the shooter had used a revolver, leaving behind no evidence. The second victim, critically injured but alive, became the focus. He had been shot twice, once in the shoulder, once grazing his abdomen, but he couldn't or wouldn't talk. Witnesses were few. Most residents had heard gunshots but were too afraid to look outside. Fear kept mouths shut. As days turned to weeks, the trail grew colder. Phone records revealed David had received a call shortly before his death from a burner phone. Untraceable. The few cameras that did work caught a glimpse of a dark hoodie and jeans. But no face, no license plates, no clear shot. The shooter had vanished into the night, leaving nothing but questions behind. Without a clear suspect, detectives speculated, was David a random victim caught in Philadelphia's rising tide of gun violence, or was this personal? Investigators found no sign of robbery. David's wallet, watch, and cell phone were still on him. Nothing was stolen. This was an assassination. More digging revealed David had been struggling financially. There were hints he might have been helping transport packages between Coatesville and Philly. Packages that, police believed, contained drugs. Nothing was proven. But in the underworld, even suspicion could get you killed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something simpler. Jealousy, revenge, a long-forgotten grudge. In the end, it didn't matter. David Johnson was dead, and the city, like it so often does, simply moved on. The most haunting part of David Johnson's story, there was no justice, no arrests, no named suspects, no closure for his family. David's mother still leaves flowers at the corner of Bainbridge Street every year, hoping, praying that someday someone will talk. That someday justice will find the man who murdered her son. But as the months stretched into years, David's murder became just another case number in Philadelphia's overflowing homicide files. Another name on a growing list. Another life lost to a city drowning in blood. As the city of Philadelphia mourned another unsolved death. Across the country, in California's most notorious prison, a different David Johnson was preparing for violence of another kind. A riot that would stain San Quentin's walls in blood. Coming up next, Case 5, David Johnson, San Quentin 6, 1971. When walls can't hold monsters, even the strongest fortress becomes a slaughterhouse. August 21st, 1971. San Quentin State Prison, California. It was a place designed to break men, to strip them of identity, hope, and dreams. Inside, inmates battled not only the guards, but each other, their humanity tested daily. But that morning, something ancient and primal boiled over. Blood, betrayal, and death would become the currency traded inside San Quentin's thick, cold walls. Among those at the center of it all was David Johnson, a name now infamously tied to the San Quentin Six, a group of inmates whose violent uprising would leave 6 people dead and the nation horrified. The crime? A carefully orchestrated prison escape attempt that turned into one of the bloodiest chapters in American correctional history. But it wasn't just about escape. It was about revolution, revenge, and the ultimate collapse of human restraint. David Johnson wasn't supposed to be a headline. Born in Oakland, California, Johnson had grown up amid the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. Poverty, racial tension, and street violence had carved deep scars into his young life. By his early 20s, he'd fallen into a pattern of petty crimes that eventually escalated into robbery and assault. By 1971, Johnson had been transferred to San Quentin, a maximum security prison infamous for housing the state's most dangerous inmates. Inside, he was drawn into the orbit of radicalized prisoners like George Jackson, a prominent activist and member of the Black Panther Party. Jackson had already made headlines after publishing Soledad Brother, a searing indictment of racism in America's prison system. To David Johnson and others, Jackson wasn't just another inmate. He was a symbol, a leader, a spark. And that spark was about to ignite an inferno. The plan? Free George Jackson during a routine meeting with his attorneys. Escape with hostages if necessary. Turn San Quentin into a battlefield if needed. It was bold. It was desperate. It was doomed. The morning of the incident, Jackson was handed a package during a legal visit. Inside, a concealed pistol. Within moments, chaos erupted. Jackson and his small group of loyalists, including David Johnson, attacked correctional officers. They took hostages, guards and inmates alike. They demanded safe passage. David Johnson's specific role was chilling. He attempted to strangle a prison guard with his bare hands, nearly killing him before other guards intervened. The uprising spiraled out of control. In a hail of gunfire and bludgeoning, 6 people died. 3 guards, 3 inmates, including George Jackson himself, shot dead by tower guards. David Johnson was captured amid the carnage, his hands bloodied, his clothes torn. San Quentin's floors were slick with blood. The scent of gunpowder, sweat, and death hung in the air for days. The official investigation into the San Quentin Six lasted nearly 2 years. Thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of hours of testimony, millions of dollars spent. And at the center of it, David Johnson, a symbol of everything society feared about dangerous prisoners, and paradoxically, a symbol of the system's deep, festering rot. What drove David Johnson? Was it loyalty? Following a charismatic leader to what seemed like revolution? Was it hatred? A deep-seated rage against a system that had caged him, branded him, and discarded him? Or was it simple survival? A desperate act by a man cornered by a world that gave him no options? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Witnesses later testified that Johnson had been quiet in the days leading up to the riot. Focused, not angry, resigned. He knew what was coming. They all did. And still they chose violence over submission. They chose to make history, even if it was written in blood. The trials of the San Quentin Six became a media circus. Protesters rallied outside the courthouse daily. Journalists spilled ink painting the defendants as either monsters or martyrs. David Johnson was charged with assault, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder. While some charges were dropped or reduced over the years, he was ultimately convicted of assault for his attack on the guard. He remained in prison for decades, finally released in 1993 after serving over 20 years behind bars. By the time he stepped back into the free world, the world had changed. But David Johnson remained a relic of a darker era. He disappeared into obscurity after his release, his name forever etched alongside one of the bloodiest prison uprisings in American history. As the iron gates of San Quentin slammed shut on one David Johnson's bloody chapter, in a quiet town in Missouri, another David Johnson was about to turn a New Year's Eve party into a night of terror and death. Coming up next, Case 6, David Johnson, Wright City, Missouri, 2009. Sometimes, the face of evil isn't lurking in the shadows. It's smiling, laughing, blending in, until the knife flashes. It was supposed to be a night of laughter, celebration, and new beginnings. New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2008, into January 1st, 2009. The small town of Wright City, Missouri, population barely 3,000, buzzed with quiet excitement as families and friends gathered to usher in 2009. At a modest house party on a quiet suburban street, balloons floated against the ceiling, pop songs blasted from speakers, and drinks flowed freely. Among the guests were local young adults, including Fernando A. Melgar, a 22-year-old with dreams bigger than the tiny town could hold. But as midnight approached, the party's atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, the laughter thinned. David Johnson, alongside his brother and another accomplice, stormed into the house, armed and intent on violence. In a matter of minutes, the new year would be soaked not in champagne, but in blood. David Johnson wasn't just another party-goer. He and his brother weren't invited. They weren't friends with the hosts. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there for payback. Earlier in the night, Johnson had been involved in an altercation at another party, humiliated, beaten, and thrown out. Furious and fueled by alcohol and pride, he plotted a vicious retaliation. Dragging his brother and a friend into the scheme, Johnson returned to Wright City armed with knives and blunt weapons. Their plan was crude: storm the party, instill fear, make an example. Fernando Melgar was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He tried to calm the situation, stepping between the aggressors and his terrified friends. For his bravery, Fernando was stabbed multiple times, collapsing onto the living room floor as the party exploded into chaos. Another young man was severely wounded, barely escaping with his life. By the time police arrived, Fernando was dead, his blood soaking into the beige carpet, a twisted party streamer still clinging to his wrist. The new year had arrived, but for Fernando Melgar, it had arrived in death. The Wright City Police Department launched an immediate manhunt. Witnesses described the attackers, rough sketches of 3 men, armed and dangerous. It didn't take long for tips to pour in. David Johnson's name came up again and again. He was well known to local authorities. Previous arrests for assault, disorderly conduct, and public drunkenness. Detectives tracked Johnson down within days, hiding out in a nearby town. When they burst through the door of the small apartment where he was holed up, Johnson didn't resist. He was sitting on a sagging couch, blank-eyed, holding a half-empty bottle of vodka. The evidence was damning: bloodstains matching Fernando's DNA on Johnson's clothes. Witness testimony placing him at the scene. A confession from his brother implicating him as the primary aggressor. David Johnson had brought a knife to a party and left with blood on his hands. At its core, Johnson's motive was simple and terrifying: pride, humiliation, revenge. Witnesses said Johnson felt disrespected after being kicked out of an earlier gathering. In his mind, that slight could only be answered with violence. Investigators later unearthed chilling text messages sent by Johnson in the hours leading up to the attack. "They're gonna pay for this. Ain't nobody gonna punk me." Fueled by rage and alcohol, Johnson chose bloodshed over moving on. He couldn't let it go, and an innocent young man paid the ultimate price. In 2016, after years of delays, appeals, and retrials, David Johnson was finally convicted. Second-degree murder for the killing of Fernando Melgar, assault for the stabbing of the second victim, armed criminal action for using a deadly weapon. The court sentenced Johnson to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, alongside additional time for the assault and weapons charges. During sentencing, Fernando's mother addressed Johnson directly. "You stole my son's life over nothing. You left him on the floor to die like he was nothing, but he was everything to us." Johnson showed no emotion as the sentence was read. No apologies, no tears. Only the cold, detached look of a man who had let anger ruin not just his life, but countless others. 6 men, 6 crimes. One name, David Johnson. But behind the repetition of a name lies something even darker. The chilling reality that evil doesn't wear a single face. And the most horrifying patterns are the ones hiding in plain sight. Stick around for the conclusion, where we connect all the chilling dots. 6 crimes, 6 men, one name whispered behind blood-stained doors: David Johnson. 6 men, 6 tragedies, 6 shattered sets of lives and families. And yet, not one of these David Johnsons was the same. Not by blood, not by origin. The only thread binding them was coincidence and carnage. If you take a step back, you realize something chilling. Different states, different decades, different crimes. Yet the same fatal undercurrents flow through every case. Pride that spiraled into rage. Entitlement that turned into violence. Desperation that drowned out conscience. Revenge that robbed innocent lives. The name was a coincidence. The choices were not. In each story, anger festered unchecked. Grievances, real or imagined, bloated until they birthed bloodshed. an inability to walk away, an unwillingness to let wounds heal, a decision to hurt rather than heal. This is the real horror behind the David Johnsons. Not that 6 men with the same name became criminals, but that 6 men, like so many others, chose violence again and again when life gave them other roads to walk. It's easy to focus on the killers, their mugshots, their trials, their sentences. But in the shadows of every David Johnson story are the forgotten ones. The night watchman who never made it home to see another sunrise. The young girl whose childhood was stolen forever. The truck driver whose kids waited for a father who would never walk through the door. The grieving family still waiting for justice in Philadelphia. The prison guard whose life was nearly choked out behind concrete walls. The New Year's party guests whose laughter turned to screaming. These are the names we rarely hear. The faces lost in the glare of courtrooms and crime scene tape. They are the true victims. The reason these stories matter. Why Shadows of Crime Chronicles exists. And that brings us to why you're here. Why Shadows of Crime Chronicles exists. We are not here to glorify the killers. We are not here to sensationalize pain. We are here to tell the stories the world forgets, to shed light where others have looked away, to give voice to the silenced, and honor the humanity stolen from them. We dive deep not just for curiosity, but to understand, to learn, to recognize the patterns and warning signs, so that perhaps, somewhere, someday, another tragedy might be stopped before it starts. If these stories have gripped you, if you felt your heart sink with Fernando's death, or your blood run cold at Timothy Robinson's final moments, or your soul ache for the families left behind, then I invite you to become part of the mission. Like this video, it helps push these stories to more eyes and ears. Subscribe to Shadows of Crime Chronicles, so you never miss a case that needs to be heard. Share this story with friends, with family, with anyone who needs to remember that behind every crime headline, there are human lives shattered forever. Every click, every comment, every share means these victims are remembered. Not just as statistics, but as people who mattered. Let's keep their memories alive. Let's shine a light into the darkest places. Together, we refuse to let their stories fade into the shadows.